This is an M5 diesel locomotive air horn. The first mainline locomotives ordered by the New South Wales Government Railways was the 40 class. 20 members of this class entered service in 1951 and into 1952, and they were fitted with M5 horns. There were two manufacturers of this type of horn. Robert Swanson, a Canadian, designed and developed the horn and founded a company in Canada called Chime. Chime granted Nathan in the USA a license to produce the horn for the American market and also some export customers. I have two M-type horns that we will examine in this short presentation. My M5 was removed from locomotive 4019 early in January 1970. I was spending the day with a fitter at DLEC, and his first job was to take the horn off the locomotive, clean the horn, inspect it, and get it ready to be placed back onto 4004, which was still in service. However, after about 5 minutes worth of work, it became obvious that this horn off 4019 was not going to come apart easily, and a number of parts were eventually broken in the process. The foreman at the time was fed up with working on these horns and issued instructions that the horn be thrown out, but instead of going into a dumpster, it found its way into the boot of my car. The M3 horn was found at Chullora workshops in the early 1990s. Nobody who worked there at the time knew what it had been removed from. It probably did not come off a locomotive because, as far as I'm aware, M3 horns were never fitted to locomotives in New South Wales. It was suggested that it may have come off a rail maintenance vehicle of some type, or perhaps a breakdown crane. The horns produced by both companies are basically identical, but there are two cosmetic differences that you can use to identify the manufacturer. The Chime horns have the logo Chime cast inside the flare of the mouth of each bell. The Nathan horns have Nathan Chime logos on blocks cast on the sides of each bell. Another way to identify the manufacturer of an M-type horn is to examine the shape of the base of each bell and its corresponding spot on the manifold. Chime bells have a round base, whereas Nathan Chime bells have a more scallop-type shape. The 20 members of the 40 class were built in Canada by Alco and were thus fitted with Chime M5 horns. As I've said earlier, my M5 was produced by Nathan. So how did it come to be here? Because it wasn't one of the original horns supplied with the 40 class. The answer to this question lies in a change in the contract for the second batch of locomotives ordered by the New South Wales Railways for mainline service. That was the 6 members of the 42 class built by Clyde Engineering and delivered during 1955. The contract originally stipulated that M5 horns be fitted to the locomotives. Clyde already had a well-established supply chain developed between themselves and EMD in the United States, so parts for the locomotives were promptly ordered, including 6 Nathan Chime M5 whistles. In the meantime, the railways decided that they would rather have the newly developed P5 horns fitted to the locomotives. These horns were much easier to maintain. The contract was altered and P5 horns were fitted, but the railways kept the 6 Nathan M5s to use as spares for the 40 class horns. This means that the horn that was removed from 4019 in January 1970, being a Nathan horn, was one of the 6 horns purchased by Clyde originally for the 42 class, but then allocated as spares at DLEC to be rotated through the 40 class as the original horns were taken off to be serviced. I'll demonstrate some of the maintenance issues associated with M-type horns by dismantling the diaphragm housing on my M3. Firstly though, here is a rear view of an M5 horn. You will notice that the diaphragm housing for each bell is of a different diameter. That means you needed 5 different sized diaphragms for each horn. Each diaphragm housing has a back cap that screws in. Once you arrive at the right tension, there is a clamp bolt that is screwed in. The horn will then sound correctly. This means that each horn has to be tuned once it's reassembled. Obviously, this became quite a deafening process once you had 1 or 2 bells sounding. The first step in dismantling an M horn is to undo the clamp bolt. These bolts were often mild steel, and if they had corroded and seized, there was your first problem. Once the clamp bolt was released, you then used an appropriate sized pin spanner to unscrew the back cap. You'll see in a moment that the threads for the back cap are very fine. If these had been damaged or seized, the back cap was often extremely difficult to get off. If too much force was applied, the island that fitted the spanner in the middle of the back cap would often shear off. If that didn't break, something else certainly would. Ordinarily, you could apply heat to loosen up seized parts, but in this case, doing so would permanently ruin the diaphragm. It would warp and buckle. You can see that the diaphragm consists of a number of discs that are bolted together. Grooves can be worn into the discs where they sit against the nozzle and the back cap ring. You can flip the discs over, but once a groove gets worn onto that side, the discs become useless. If you needed to remove the diaphragm housing or the bell, you had to unscrew 3 bolts. These bolts went through the diaphragm housing, through the manifold, and screwed directly into the bell. If these bolts had seized in the bell, you had another major problem on your hands. Towards the end of the working life of the 40 class, the fitters at DLEC were pretty much fed up with working on these M5 horns. They created this simple tool to remove troublesome back caps. The socket spanner handle was extended with a piece of pipe and enough force applied to either get the back cap moving or it broke. This technique was used on the horn that came off 4019. The end result was 2 broken back caps and a cracked diaphragm housing. After the final 40 class was withdrawn from service, some of the M5 horns were placed in storage. They were occasionally used on 43 and 42 class locomotives. There's even a photograph showing them on a 442 class loco. Of the 26 horns that were supplied, that's 20 air chimes and 6 Nathans, I've been able to find 5 of them. Over the past few years I've been able to find spare parts on eBay and repair my horn. It will be interesting to see if any more of these horns come to light over the next few years. There is at least one interesting horn up at the Dorrigo Museum that has no markings on it at all. It's not known how that horn came to be here, but it was in the stores at DLEC. Perhaps the New South Wales Railways were casting some of their own parts. This is a Model P 5-chime air horn, produced under licence from Air Chime by Nathan in the United States. 6 were fitted to the 42 class and 6 to the 43s in 1955 and 1956. This specific horn was salvaged from locomotive 4304 when it was set aside at Broadmeadow Loco Depot prior to scrapping in 1977. Approximately the first 30 members of the 44 class were fitted with these horns in 1958, but problems soon emerged when they were activated by the valve in the B-end cab. Only one horn was mounted on the A end with 2 bells reversed. In Ron Preston's book on the 44 class there's a fairly detailed explanation of these problems. The initial decision was to place a second P5 on the B end of the 44 class loco, but that just proved too expensive. At the same time, the Commonwealth Government introduced new rules that stipulated that wherever possible, locally produced components should be used in these locomotives. A decision was made by the railways to stop using the P5 and begin to use pairs of Westinghouse Horns. There'll be more detail on the Westinghouse Horns later. In 1978, the use of P5s began in earnest when they were fitted to the 80 class, and from then on they became the favoured horn for new locomotives. The 81s, the 85s, the 86s, the 82s and the 90 class all had P5s fitted. The 46 class, selected for overhauls at Valley Heights, also received new P5s. The P5s fitted from 1978 onwards sounded very different to the ones that were fitted back in the 1950s. That was because in the interim period, Nathan had changed the patterns for the casting of the horns. Those horns produced in the 1950s are often described as old cast horns or first generation horns. They can be identified by the words pat pending cast into the base of each bell. The newer horns have just pat penned. The difference in sound between the old cast and new cast horns is quite distinctive. Another way you can identify if you have an old horn is by looking at the back cap of each bell. First generation horns and some early second generation had Nathan cast twice on the back cap. On newer horns, the word Nathan is only cast once. The only real maintenance issue with these horns occurred when rainwater flowed down through the very small air inlet at the base of each bell. This water would often deposit a form of powder which settled into a paste and blocked the air getting into the bell. To clear this, you needed to either remove the back caps or unbolt the bell from the manifold. This problem was especially prevalent with the 86 class locos because rainwater would carry some of the lubricant off the pantographs. This lubricant contained filings of copper from the overhead catenary. This would react with the aluminium inside the bell and produce a lot of oxide. This oxide would almost form like a cement around the air inlet. This also caused a chemical reaction with the steel bolts and back cap screws. These bolts would corrode and expand into the aluminium, and that made it very difficult to get the horns apart. So if you're going to purchase a P5, make sure it's not one that's come off an 86 class. It may prove difficult to get apart. Each bell has the same size diaphragm, so you only need to stock one type of diaphragm, not 5 different ones. The nozzle has a rubber ring mounted on it. A rubber gasket goes on either side of the diaphragm, so there is no metal-to-metal wear. As long as the rubber gaskets haven't deteriorated, the horn will keep working for many, many years. This is a pair of Westinghouse horns, typical of what was fitted to the 44s, the 45s, the 46s, most of the 48s, the 49s and the 421s. The types of brackets used to mount the horns varied from class to class, but were all basically the same. These Australian produced horns were very easy to maintain. Brass screws that were threaded into a bronze body meant that the back caps were easy to remove. Those screws very rarely seized. The diaphragm was easy to replace, and the horns were very durable. This horn, removed from locomotive 44232, was made by RVB in Australia. They were introduced from the late 1960s and were fitted to the 422, the 442, the 73 classes and the Mark III 48s. They proved to be very unsuccessful. The diaphragms would often seize, the spun copper trumpets were very fragile and could be knocked off and broken easily. In actual fact, it was very rare to hear one of these horns operating as designed. They quickly received the nickname Screaming Cats and proved to be very unpopular with crews. In conclusion then, what we've shown is that over the 50 years, beginning with the introduction of the 40 class through to the end of government ownership of the railways in New South Wales, 4 main types of locomotive horns were used: the M5, the P5, a pair of Westinghouse horns, and the dreaded RVB 5 chimes.